Hey, this is Robert, and welcome to today's show. The Electoral College. Many groups in the past have tried to get rid of it. Many today are trying to change it. The topic became alive again in 2016 with the electoral victory of Donald Trump, while Hillary Clinton received the popular vote edge. Now presidential candidate, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren tweeted a couple years ago, and I quote, "In 2016, nearly 3 million more people voted for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump, but Trump took the presidency. That's not exactly the sign of a healthy democracy. Democracy hangs on the idea that whoever gets the most votes wins." Is that true? Joining me to take a deeper look at the Electoral College is Trent England. Trent is the director of the Save Our States project at the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, and he's an attorney. Trent England, welcome to the show, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's good to be here.
Now, there's been a lot of proposals of recent, and it really goes back a number of years, to reform or eliminate the Electoral College. But let's go ahead and start with the basics, the foundation. What does the Constitution say about the Electoral College?
Yeah, so the Electoral College is part of the original Constitution, and it's been modified just once by the 12th Amendment, which was really early in our history. The Electoral College, the Constitution creates the Electoral College based on Congress, really, and that's a kind of an easy way to think about it. Every state has the same say in the Electoral College as it has in Congress. It has the number of electoral votes equal to how many members it has in the U.S. House of Representatives, of course, it's based on population, plus 2 for its 2 senators. And, the way this works today in every state other than Maine and Nebraska is that, everybody in your state votes for a presidential candidate. I mean, we think of it that way, but really we're voting for a slate of electors, and those electors get together in December and cast the official votes for president, which seems, it kind of seems complicated, but the idea that the founders had was they were concerned about intrigue. They were concerned about, some things that sound very modern, like foreign influence in elections. And they wanted to have a system, like they did in everything else, of checks and balances. And so this 2-step election process for president is that way. It has some checks and balances that I'm sure we'll get into. The 12th Amendment changed it because originally the runner-up became vice president. So, whoever came in second became vice president. That was not a big deal for George Washington, but it was a really big deal for John Adams when Thomas Jefferson was vice president, and a big deal for Jefferson. And so that was changed by the 12th Amendment. So now we have a ticket, and that's why we vote for president and vice president. We know who the vice presidential candidate is. That's the one change. Other than that, it's been the same in the Constitution, except that states do have the power, and I know we're going to wind up talking a lot about this. States do have the power to figure out how to best represent their state. Legislatures can appoint electors directly. They can have a statewide election. They can do what they do in Maine and Nebraska. They can have an election in each congressional district. So legislatures have some leeway, although there is a question about just how much leeway they have.
Yeah. So let's go back to the framers. Are there any specific quotes or anything that's found in the Federalist or Anti-Federalist papers that have the framers actually talking about this particular issue?
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, in the Federalist Papers, there's a great quote from Alexander Hamilton, who, when he talks about the mode of election of the executive, of the president, he points out, and this is true, that it was not very controversial. I mean, he says, to paraphrase, he says, it's kind of surprising. This is one of the few parts of the Constitution that the Anti-Federalists aren't up in arms about, and he's right. He goes on to say, if it be not perfect, it is at least excellent, which is fascinating. It's so controversial today, and yet during this fight over whether to ratify the Constitution at all, pretty much everybody agreed this is a pretty good way to elect a president.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you this question because I think there's a lot of confusion with the general public. And what's the difference between democracy and a republic?
So there are a lot of different answers to that question, and I was in a hearing on this national popular vote plan that we're gonna talk about in a while, up in New Hampshire, and this became a really contentious point in the hearing, with a legislator arguing with multiple different people who were testifying. You know, democracy today has come to mean, to most people, just a system where we have elections, and you know, by that definition, we're a democracy. Russia's a democracy. You know, Canada's a democracy. Everybody who has elections is a democracy. At the time of the American founding, democracy meant something really particular, really specific. It meant that to the maximum extent possible, people just directly voted for their government. That might mean that they actually, you know, created laws by plebiscite. It might mean that they only had basically a House of Representatives, where, you know, you just, instead of having checks and balances in government, you have this really direct representative system. A republic was always understood to be a system that used democratic means to do something higher than just sort of take the immediate will of the people's emotions, and translate that into power, into force. Mm-hmm. The idea of a republic, I think, is a government where we govern ourselves through representatives, and a system of checks and balances that really seeks to not just, you know, enforce the people's will, but to do justice, right? To do what's right. And you know, that's where I think, I mean, a republic is this rich concept of a government where we actually respect individual rights, and yet we use democratic systems to make sure that government ultimately rests with the people.
And honestly, the founders weren't very fond of democratic systems, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, for folks who study history, I don't think anybody who really studies history seriously can be very fond of anything like direct democracy, because it never works. And, you know, it always turns out to be that old saw. I think, I don't know if Franklin coined it, but I think he used it, right? That democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner. I mean, you know, some people miss the fact that the most undemocratic part of the United States Constitution is the Bill of Rights, because the Bill of Rights says, I don't care what kind of a majority you have. You can't establish a church. You can't infringe on freedom of speech, right? You can't search somebody's home without a warrant, good reason, right? I mean, that's anti-democratic, and yet that is at the heart of our republic.
You kind of touched on in the first question about how the Electoral College works. Is there any other details that you think you need to add to that?
You know, the Electoral College does a lot of things. It creates a lot of incentives in our system that I think are really important. I mean, mechanically, it is important to remember that electors are real people. You know, states actually, you're actually electing electors who cast those electoral votes, and sometimes we've had protest votes. Even just in the last election, you have an elector who gets elected, who's supposed to vote for Hillary Clinton, and then votes for somebody else, and you know, people get mad about that. It's never amounted in the modern era to anything more than just somebody making a protest. So you know, that has never actually swung an election. But
electors are allowed to do that, though, right?
There's a debate over this. A lot of states have passed state laws that say that electors are pledged, that they're required to vote for the candidate of the political party that nominated the elector, and you know, therefore the candidate who won that state. There's some litigation going on right now over whether those laws are valid, and it's an interesting question, because it gets to the heart of, you know, how much power do state legislatures really have to control the Electoral College? Is the Electoral College supposed to be a deliberative body? The founders kind of thought that it would be that, but it never worked out that way. And you know, even in their own era, right? Even when the American founders and the framers of the Constitution were involved in the process, once they set it up, they didn't use it as a deliberative process. Everybody, it just wasn't really a natural way to work it out. Once you were beyond George Washington, and everybody knew that they were going to deliberate and choose George Washington, so it didn't really matter then. So, yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, I think one of the important things about the Electoral College is that while it seems a little bit complicated, and I'll go back to kind of where I started, it's a lot like Congress. It's a two-step system, and it's actually not as unusual as people think.
Well, piggybacking on that, are there any other countries that do anything like this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, every parliamentary system where there's a prime minister, that prime minister is not directly elected. The prime minister is elected through a two-step process. Now, the framers of the Constitution deliberated that kind of a system, and they decided they didn't want Congress to have so much direct control over the president, so they created the Electoral College, like this sort of separate temporary Congress to choose the president. But every parliamentary system is a two-step geography-based, at least to some degree, geography-based system. And my favorite example is India. India is a young country, created its constitution after they won independence from Great Britain just in the 20th century. And when they set up their presidential election system, they created what they call sometimes an electoral college. It's based on geography, and it's based on a two-stage election because India is very big. It's very diverse. People in the north speak a different language than people in the south, and actually people in the middle. I mean, there are dozens of languages spoken in India. There are multiple religions practiced there. The big risk to Indian politics is regionalism, and I think that's actually a risk to American politics too. And to defeat regionalism, or at least to moderate it as much as they could, they created an electoral college system that it's not exactly the same as ours. It's a lot more complicated, frankly, but it does the job.
Let me ask you about Canada real quick. I've heard people say, and I don't know if this is true or not, that whoever Toronto votes for, that's who the prime minister or president is up there. So Canada has a strictly popular vote?
No. The Prime Minister of Canada is elected through the parliamentary system.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, Canada is, if people in the United States feel like we have a urban versus rural divide, Canada, even with their parliamentary system, has a dramatic urban-rural split because most of Canada's population is sort of it's cold the further you get north up there, right? So they're sort of snuggled along the U.S. border, and and within that, then they have a few really big cities, and so I mean, even with a parliamentary system, a lot of folks in kind of the rest of Canada feel very left out, but no, I mean, Canada's a traditional parliamentary system. This came up at a legislative hearing too. Somebody was saying, well, Canada has better voter turnout. If we change our system, we'll get better voter turnout. I pointed out to them, it's a parliamentary system. Great Britain's a parliamentary system. In Germany, they have kind of a modified parliamentary system, and I mean, all of those use two-stage electoral processes.
So what is the national popular vote? And I imagine you're going to tell me it's a bad idea.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you that, but I'll explain what it is first. Yeah. It's a very clever idea. I mean, I've got to give it to them. There have been people who have wanted to get rid of the Electoral College for a long time. And after Al Gore lost in 2000, one of his supporters, actually an elector for Al Gore in the state of California, named John Koza, came up with this plan. And what it is, it's an interstate compact. So states join interstate compacts through legislation. So basically, it's state legislation that would create an agreement among the states that adopt that legislation. And what it says is that we pledge as a state to ignore how people vote in our own state and to instead appoint our electors based on whichever candidate wins the most votes nationwide. So the idea is, without amending the Constitution, without going through any of the Article 5 processes to change the Constitution, they're just going to sort of, I don't mean to use this in such a pejorative way, but to sort of hijack the Electoral College in order to turn it into the direct election of the president. So, I mean, in that sense, it's clever. It claims to use the power that state legislatures have to decide how to appoint their electors. And it creates an agreement among a group of states that only takes effect if it's passed by enough states that they equal 270 electoral votes, which controls the outcome. So states can pass this, and 11 states so far, plus the District of Columbia, have done that, but it doesn't have any effect on elections unless they have enough states pass it that they actually would control the outcome at that point. So it's clever. We can talk about the constitutional problems with it, the practical problems with it, but I mean, ultimately, advocates for national popular vote say we're not trying to get rid of the Electoral College, but it would have the effect of creating the direct election of the President of the United States if it was upheld by courts and went into effect.
Now, I've heard a lot of people say this in the past, that the best explanation for the Electoral College is slavery. Any truth to that?
Not really. Not the way, when people say that, not the way they mean it, right? Because there is this argument out there that kind of anything anybody doesn't like about the Constitution can be explained because the Constitution was written at a time when there was slavery, and it was written by some people who were slave owners at least, and ratified by. And the reality of the Electoral College is that the framers of the Constitution debated a lot of ways to elect a president. They weren't sure. It was not a North-South divide. And this is true even of the Great Compromise that created Congress, which the Electoral College is based on. It was not a North-South debate. And this is where sometimes people know enough history to be dangerous. The fact is, if you go back and look at the Constitutional Convention, these were big state, small state debates, and there were big and small states in the North. Most of the southern states, if you only counted their non-slave population, tended to be smaller, but there were still states in the South that were bigger than some of the states in the North. And so, claiming that these compromises are based on slavery is, at best, a kind of a half-truth. And really, with the Electoral College, this is something that was promoted by none other than Alexander Hamilton, who was against slavery, who missed part of the Constitutional Convention because he was at an anti-slavery meeting. So, I think it's unfortunate that people go there because it really doesn't explain what was going on at the Constitutional Convention. It certainly doesn't explain what's going on today.
Yeah, it sounds like you need a little bit of understanding of history to really feel that, right? Another thing critics like to say is that, I'm in the state of Florida. State governors are elected by counting all the voters equally. So why not the president?
Yeah. Well, here is where bigness just matters. And and it really does in politics. I think you see it the most if we shrink ourselves down and think about and I guess it depends on what kind of a city you live in, but if you think about a city council seat or a town council or a county commissioner, at the most local level in government, this is actually true in states like New Hampshire in their legislature. If an elected person has a few thousand people that they represent, that's a really different relationship than when you get to 30,000. Let alone when you get to 300,000, let alone when you get to 3 million, right? These are, people draw these analogies that just don't really fit. As the size of that area goes up, you have unique problems. So in a district of a compact city council district with 3,000 people in it, or a legislative district in New Hampshire that has 3,000 people in it, regionalism is not really a big concern. And partisanship doesn't even matter that much. If you follow politics in New Hampshire, and Maine is a little bit like this, Vermont's like this even, they have wild swings in their legislatures because the districts are so small that people actually have personal relationships with their elected officials. And they don't, it doesn't matter as much if Jimmy's a Democrat or a Republican, because I know Jimmy and I saw him at the diner last week, and if he's not representing me well, I'm going to vote Jimmy out. That presidential politics doesn't work that way. Gubernatorial politics doesn't work that way, but at least in our states, we're a little bit less at a risk of regional politics. Once you get to the national level, there's a real risk that the interests of Florida are so different from the interests of Wyoming, which are so different from the interests of New York, that that it's better to have a system where you can't just win based on intense popularity in one region, but you actually have a system, and the Electoral College does this really well. I think it does it better than the founders ever imagined it would, that forces candidates to do what, they talk about expanding the map. Mm-hmm. Right. Every time we hear them talking about expanding the map or Howard Dean's 50-state strategy, it's the Electoral College that's driving that and driving them away from where they're most popular and into these areas where they're a little bit behind. It's profoundly healthy for our national politics.
Yeah, so it's absolutely true that the East Coast and the West Coast and Chicago would dictate the elections every 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to see how that wouldn't be the case. I mean, not to go super wonky on you, but to put it in economic terms, the transaction costs of politics go down as population density goes up. So the more people who are packed into a smaller area, it's just easier to do politics. So, and people say, well, this is why it's going to benefit the Democrats. Well, sure. I mean, Democrats draw a lot of their power from the big cities. And so it probably would benefit the Democrats somewhat. But it's also going to send Republicans going, if not to the urban centers, to suburbia and leaving a lot of small town America behind. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a real concern. I mean, one of the divides at the Constitutional Convention really was this, right? It was urban interests versus, at the time, they thought mostly in terms of farmers, right? But everybody outside of the cities, and part of what the Senate does, everything that gives small states a little boost in political power, is to try to balance that out somewhat.
Let me read something off your website, Save Our States, and it says the Electoral College turns swing states into microcosms of America, where candidates are forced to go beyond the big cities and reach out to all kind of people. Kind of what you've already said, and that's a good thing. Yeah. I mean, people should remember it's not that only the swing states matter. I've heard this lots of times. Well, only the swing states matter. The only way the swing states matter is that the candidates actually have these huge bases of support that they already enjoy. Hillary Clinton, she already had a lot of support in California, and she had to have that support in California before she could go to Nevada, and she had to poll well in Nevada before she could go to Utah. And she actually had a campaign office in Utah, trying to kind of expand the map during part of the election. Donald Trump had to be strong in Texas before he could go to Florida, before he could go to Pennsylvania and Michigan, right? And yet it does, as the election goes on, it does drive the candidates not just to those swing states. It drives them both to those swing states, which I think is particularly good, right? It drives our politics sort of together. So you don't have the Democrats spending all their time campaigning in Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York, and the Republicans spending all this time campaigning in suburban Texas and suburban Florida, right? They actually wind up in the same places, campaigning for the same voters, trying to make these arguments that appeal to people who are, relatively in the middle of the country. I think I just think it's profoundly healthy for our national politics. Is the current Electoral College system skewed toward either party, in your opinion?
I don't think so. I mean, the obvious caveat is the Electoral College has benefited in the sense that it's helped a party win who didn't have the most popular votes, Republicans in 2016 and 2000. But the reality is, people point this out. There have been opportunities where the Democrats came close to benefiting that way. And if we just accept the fact that the Electoral College is the rules of the game, then look, those are the rules of the election, and the winner is the winner. I mean, I think it's more important to think in terms of the interests or the people that it benefits. It certainly gives a boost to voters in smaller population states. It certainly gives a boost to kind of the middle of our political spectrum. I think benefits because of the Electoral College through the effect that we talked about, driving the candidates together. I think that's the real effect of the Electoral College. And then the parties try to strategize around that. And the party that benefits is the party that does it better.
Yeah. Now, piggybacking on that, concerning the election of Donald Trump, did the Electoral College function the way it was supposed to?
Yeah, I mean, in this, my friends who are diehard Hillary Clinton people are not going to like this, but I think it's just inescapable that 2016 was really a triumph of the Electoral College, and a lot of the criticism of Hillary Clinton's campaign points this out, although they don't often go all the way and talk about the Electoral College. But look, I mean, Hillary Clinton ran a campaign that was designed to sit on a lead that it turned out she didn't really have. And, the Electoral College rewards candidates for reaching out, and it rewards candidates for being aggressive in the sense of, going to a state where you're slightly behind and trying to effectively make your argument to win over some of those voters who are undecided. And, I mean, Donald Trump did that. Donald Trump won states that Republicans hadn't won in a generation. Yeah. Pennsylvania, Michigan, that was, in Florida. That's a good thing for our politics. Even people who don't like Donald Trump, I think, should be able to acknowledge it's better to have a system that rewards outreach rather than rewarding sitting on your lead. And that's exactly what happened in 2016.
Yeah. I'm going to read something else from your website, Save Our States, and I want you to elaborate on it when I'm done.
Sure.
The Electoral College is like a stabilizer for American politics. One of the reasons why the United States has been such a remarkably successful nation. The Electoral College unites us by recognizing and respecting the unique role of states in our federal system.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is really important in a couple different ways. The Constitution, the primary check on federal power in the Constitution is that it leaves states as states with theoretically at least, most of the political power in the system, and the Electoral College is based on that idea. And one way to think about this is we have a presidential election. I mean, really, we have 51 presidential elections, but we talk about having a presidential election. We talk about our national elections, and yet there's nobody in Washington, D.C. who's in charge of those elections. There is no presidential appointee in charge of presidential elections. I mean, nobody's going to disagree with us, right? That's a really good thing. Yeah. And I follow the news around the world, and I mean, over and over again, you see these countries where the president controls his own reelection, and obviously, whether or not there's actual chicanery involved, people don't trust it. We have this decentralized system because of the Electoral College, because the Electoral College makes this 50 different elections in the states, and then Washington, D.C. has their electors as well, and so 51 different elections. That allows power over election administration to stay at the state level, and I think that's one of the best features of this whole system that oftentimes is overlooked.
Okay, Trent, any final thoughts? Anything I didn't ask you which you probably should talk about?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned what I've written about the Electoral College being like a stabilizer, and I like to think I'll leave you with this visual because you're in Florida, and so I can talk about sailboats. Here where I am in Oklahoma, people give me blank stares. But a sailboat, at least many kinds of sailboats, right? They have a keel or they have a dagger board that sticks down underneath. And I remember the first time, I grew up in Seattle, and the first time as a little kid I saw a sailboat pulled up on a trailer, and I thought, man, that is a funky looking, awkward boat. And I think what we have going on in American politics right now is sort of like if we had some sailboat reformers come along and they looked at a sailboat out of the water and they said, you know what, that sailboat looks weird. We don't understand why that's there. Let's just shave that thing off. We'll shave it off. We'll patch it up real good. And surely then we'll take this sailboat in the water and everything will be fine. And of course, everything would be fine right until the wind blows. And then they're all going to wind up very wet. The Electoral College is like this. It's not a part of our constitutional system that we focus on a lot, that we think about a lot. Many of us, all of us, until we start to think about it, you just don't understand it intuitively. But once we figure out what it does, it's a piece of our constitutional design that helps us, when the wind blows, when the storms come, helps us to remain stable as a country. It's done that through our history, and that fundamentally is why I think we should keep it.
Yeah. Before I let you go, Trent, I want to give you a couple minutes to talk about Save Our States.
Yeah. Yeah, so when I was in college back in the 1990s, so before the 2000 election, before anybody was really thinking about this, I had a wonderful professor named Michael Ullman who believed what I've come to believe, that the Electoral College is this genius part of our Constitution that works better than the American founders even thought that it would, and he told us in class about these fights that had been had in the 1970s in Congress over an attempt to get rid of the Electoral College, and it triggered my imagination. I thought, here's something that I've never thought about before, but it's actually important, and it kind of captures the genius of the American founders, and I wanted to learn more about it. And then along comes Bush versus Gore in that election, and so this became an interest of mine. And I was working for a think tank in Washington State, and National Popular Vote came on the scene, this effort, this very clever effort to try to sort of nullify the Electoral College in place. And I created Save Our States to be the voice of the argument against National Popular Vote and for the Electoral College. And so we actually are migrating our website over to the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs website. So folks can go to the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs website on our projects tab and find it. But the best place to find out about Save Our States, we have a Facebook page. Folks can go on Facebook and just search for Save Our States. And I share really whatever I can find about the Electoral College and this argument, the legislation in different states. I give some live video updates when I'm out in state capitals. Just try to help people understand this and be a part of the fight to defend the Electoral College if they want to.
Yeah, really important stuff in this day and age for sure. And I wanted to thank you, Trent England, for sharing your thoughts with us today and providing your expertise. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much. Always glad to be on the program. It's great.